So we're looking at Numbers today, and well, it's quite a complicated book to look at. So I'm going to do my best now, take you through it. First, let me just show you where I got my sources from. I mainly relied on the Expositor's Bible Commentary. The part on Numbers is by Ronald B. Allen. This is the Expositor's Bible Commentary. If anyone wants to buy it, it is well worth it. It's only £30 for the Old Testament and New Testament. It goes through verse by verse the whole Bible. Well-known evangelical scholars. And the bit written on Numbers is excellent. Really good. Another book that's useful to use is An Introduction to the Old Testament by Raymond Dillard and Tremper Longman III. And the Word Biblical Commentary series is normally really good, but with Numbers, the one by Philip Budd, it's good for looking at the language of the Hebrew, but it gets a bit boring because he's one of these guys that doesn't believe Moses wrote Numbers, and he spends so much time going through J, E, P, and D, trying to explain why this bit was written by a Yahwist and this was written, and it gets really boring, and I think he misses the whole point of the book. And finally, the Net Study Bible has got some good notes about Numbers. Now, authorship is one of the big things when it comes to any book in the Pentateuch. And what you'll find is that a lot of people question Moses writing Numbers because he's referred to in the third person. That means, like, if I wrote a book and then I said, Duncan went to church on Sunday morning, I'm talking in the third person. And some people say, well, that couldn't be Moses. Why would he write in the third person? But really, there's no reason for that to mean Moses didn't write it, because there's a quote from Raymond Dillard and Tremper Longman. This reflects customary writing style in ancient times. So what they're arguing is that in ancient times, people did refer to themselves in the third person. So it doesn't mean Moses didn't write it. And we'll look at more of this later. The other thing, people complain about the fact that the style varies in the book. But you'll find that in other ancient manuscripts where the style varies throughout it. It doesn't mean a different person wrote it. It could mean that Numbers have been written over a long period of time. And so you've got one bit that's written on one day and one bit that's written on a completely different day, maybe even years later. Who knows? But it's not really a strong argument to say Moses didn't write it. And this is the big one, Numbers 12, verse 3. This verse says, now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And so a lot of people say, well, obviously Moses didn't write this because, and it's a good argument, he doesn't sound very humble if he's saying, well, I'm the most humble person on the earth. But we're going to look at that when we get to it, Numbers chapter 12, and I'll just give you a few suggestions of what that could be about. So anyway, yeah, some people think Moses didn't write it. One of the problems with the JEPD hypothesis, which is called the documentary hypothesis, is that it doesn't take into account a lot of archaeological discoveries now, which really do suggest an early date for Numbers. Because these guys are saying Numbers was written hundreds of years later, and it's really more applicable to like Josiah's kingdom and stuff like that. But if you look at archaeology, there's strong evidence to say Numbers was written way back then. So that's authorship out of the way. Now let's look at the structure of the book. If you can get the structure of Numbers, it will help you get the book, because it is hard to follow what's going on in Numbers. But if you look at the structure and understand the structure, you'll do okay. So it's a bifid book. Bifid. Bifid means two parts. Comes in two parts, right? The first part is about the first generation in the desert. These are the guys who God rescues them from Egypt, and they're known as the first generation living in the desert. And that's starting at chapter 1, going all the way through to chapter 25, verse 18. Then the second part is, guess what? The second generation in the desert. And that's chapters 26 going through to chapters 36, 13. So you can see that there's kind of an uneven spread here. Like most of the first part of the book, the first part of the book is actually the majority of the book. And it's talking about the first generation and all the things they do in the desert and how they keep rebelling against God and how they end up staying in the desert for roughly, rounding it up, 40 years. And then the second generation, who are the guys the young guys who come through, and God says, you are the guys that are going into the promised land, only after the first generation have all died off. So no one in this first generation goes to the promised land except 2 people, which is Joshua and Caleb. Everyone else, they have to die before God will let the people go into the promised land. So it's quite interesting. Now, this is a breakdown of the whole book. I'll go through it quickly. Remember, it's a bifid, so the first part of the bifid is the experience of the first generation in the desert, and that consists of, to start off with, the preparation for the triumphal march into the promised land. So God gets the Israelites ready so they can march into the promised land. Okay? And the way he does this is first off by setting apart the people, making the people so they're really different to the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hittites. They're completely different people. They're God's special people. And then he's setting forth the people so the people can actually go forth and take the land. So you think, well, that's it. That would be the end of the story. Spend a few days in the desert and then they go into the promised land. And that's how it could have been. But sadly, the next part here is the rebellion and judgment of a fearful people. And what you get basically is a cycle of rebellion and atonement and the record of death. From chapters 11 to chapters 20, basically. And what you got is the people keep rebelling, but the interesting thing is they rebel, but God, he'll deal with them and he'll punish them, but he'll show them mercy as well. But they keep rebelling, but he does show them mercy. This keeps going on. And then you get the climax of rebellion and hope and the end of their dying, starting at chapter 21, going through to chapter 25. And now it's going to start looking better. Now you get to the second part of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Bifid, that's it. So the second part of the bifid is the prospects for the second generation to enter the promised land. It starts at chapter 26. So remember this, as you're reading Leviticus, when you're in the first bit of it, remember the first half, you're thinking, okay, these are the people who God's getting ready to send out into the promised land. And then you get to a bit where you're like, oh, these guys are messing up. They're rebelling against God. And then finally you see, we got the second generation now. They're going to go into the promised land. And to start off with, you've got the preparation for the triumphal march to the promised land for the second generation. Chapter 26. Now, what does that look similar to? Easier than that. Look at the top. A, the preparation for the triumphal march for the promised land. So this has already happened for the first generation, and now you see it happen again for the second generation. And you'll notice in Numbers you've got 2 census taken. So you've got one numbering all the people in the first generation. These are the people that are going to go in the promised land, but they don't. And then you get another census taken later on for the second generation that's going to go. And that's part of why it's called Numbers. There's another title for it, which is called Wanderings in the Desert, which kind of sounds better in a way. I think more people would read it if it was Wanderings in the Desert, you know. But because it's called Numbers, a lot of people think it's boring, but it's not. It's fascinating. Now, the next part for this second generation, part B, is a review of the first generation's journey and words of warning and encouragement to the second generation. And it appears that Numbers was actually written for the second generation so that they could see, look, this is what's happened. You guys got to make sure you do things right. And then C, next bit, is an anticipation of the promised land, chapters 34 to 36. And finally, part D, is the prospects for the second generation are for good, but the warning from the experience of the first generation must not be forgotten. And that's kind of like the application of the whole book of Numbers. Now, this breakdown here is from the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and it's based on a guy called Olson. Olson was probably the first scholar who came along and gave the book this division, because other people tried dividing it up chronologically by time, but then people realized Numbers isn't chronological. Note that as you read through it, it's not saying this happened after this and this. It doesn't work like that. There's times where it jumps around. So it's not chronological. Some people tried to do it geographically. That didn't work. This guy came up with this bifid system, and I think this is a really helpful way to look at how it works. So let's look at the first part there. The first generation in the desert, Numbers 1 to chapter 25, verse 18. This consists of two parts. First, the preparation for the triumphal march to the promised land. And second, the rebellion and judgment of a fearful people. Now, we're going to look at this first bit, A, the preparation for the triumphal march. This splits up into two bits. First, setting apart the people, chapters 1 to 10, verse 10. And secondly, setting forth the people, chapters 10, 11, verse 11 to chapter 36. Chapter 10, verse 11 to verse 36. Now, we're going to look at setting apart the people first. And as you read it, remember, this is what it's about, is setting the people apart. Hebrew prose tends to move from a general thing to a specific thing. A general thing to a specific thing. And when you read chapters 1 to 4, you'll see this, okay? You've got chapter 1 talks about the leaders and the number of soldiers from each tribe. And when you see those long lists, notice that they're normally tribes. So when you're like, oh, what's this long list? Notice it will be one tribe and a list, next tribe and a list, and there'll always be 12 tribes. So you've got leaders and a number of soldiers from each tribe, and then chapter 2, you've got the tribes surrounding the tent of meeting, which is in the middle of the camp. Then chapter 3, you've got a census of Levite males above 1 month and listing of Levite families. And then chapter 4, you've got a census of Levites from 25 to 30 years old and the work each family was to have. And obviously the work the Levites had was to do with the tent. So you can see the way it's moving from general to getting more specific, and in the end talking about the Levites. So the chapters here are moving from the nation as a whole, the Israelites, to particular families of one tribe that are going to remain that will maintain symbols of Israel's worship. It's the Levites who end up maintaining the symbols of worship, the stuff that you've got in the tabernacle and in the tent of meeting. Also, notice each chapter is getting more specific and more narrow, but the whole time the main emphasis is worship. And notice that as you read through Numbers, the emphasis on worship. So, setting apart the people. Another thing about Hebrew prose, which is pretty similar really, look out for this. When it announces a topic, you might see that at the beginning of a chapter, it announces a topic, and then the next thing it does is it gives details of that topic, and then lastly it gives a summary. Now knowing this will help make Numbers more interesting, because as you're reading it, you understand the train of thought. And you get what's happening. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Numbers chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "So you are to appoint Aaron and his sons, and they will be responsible for their priesthood. But the unauthorized person who comes near must be put to death." Now this has just announced a topic, saying you guys have this job, but if someone who's unauthorized goes near to the area you're responsible for, that person must be put to death. That's introducing the topic. Then verse 25, and actually it's the whole section here, you'll see this topic explained in more detail. Here it says, "The Gershonites were responsible for the care of the tabernacle and tent, its coverings, the curtain at the entrance to the tent of meeting," and it goes on, and it's listing all these different sub-tribes of the different jobs and responsibilities they have to do. And then at the end, verse 38, it kind of sums it up and says, "But those who were to camp in front of the tabernacle on the east, in front of the tent of meeting, were Moses, Aaron and his sons. They were responsible for the needs of the sanctuary and for the needs of the Israelites, but the unauthorized person who approached was to be put to death." So when you see that kind of thing going on, you'll see what's happening. Okay, it's announcing the topic, it's giving details of the topic, and it's giving a summary of the topic. And it's normally because we don't know these things that we find it hard to read stuff like Numbers, because we're not aware. To our Western mindset, this isn't a very exciting way of putting out prose, but to the Hebrew mindset it would have made a lot of sense. Now also, whilst we're in chapter 3, you'll see the topic of substitution. Numbers 3:12 to 13. Look, I myself have taken the Levites from among the Israelites instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the Israelites. So the Levites belong to me, because all the firstborn are mine. When I destroyed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I set apart for myself all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. They belong to me. I am the Lord. So we saw that before, where God was going to destroy all the firstborn, and all the Egyptian firstborn died. But he saved the Israelite firstborn, and then he said, right, they belong to me now. But what he does here is he's saying, look, instead of you having to give me your firstborn, I'm going to take the Levites instead. So we've got this concept of substitution. And it's a lot of these things in the Old Testament that help us understand the New Testament when we get to it, and we see that Jesus was a substitution for us. So it's a concept that we learn in the Old Testament. At the same time, there's another concept here, which is called redemption. Because he's demanding the redemption of the firstborn, but he also provides a means of bringing that to pass. So with the firstborn, on the one hand, he's saying, look, I'll let the Levites take your place. But on the other hand, they still have to redeem their firstborn, but they do it with money. So they say, I'm going to give money to the priests as a sign of this is money to God for redeeming my firstborn that he saved. So God provides a means for redemption. And we see that in the New Testament. We can't be redeemed except by Jesus, and it was God who provided Jesus for us. Now, you'll see this phrase, I am the Lord. Numbers 3:13, he says, they belong to me, I am the Lord. And Ronald Allen, who's the guy who wrote the Numbers section on the Expositor's Bible commentary, he says this is a characteristic punctuation in the legislative portions of the Torah. So he's saying in the law, you would have punctuations where it's saying, I am the Lord, almost like an end of a paragraph, saying this is the end of this section. It adds authority and significance and weight to the text. You know, you could imagine if you was chatting to someone and they're talking, you might be kind of dozing off, and then they say, I am the mayor. You suddenly realize like they're letting you know, hey, this is important what I'm saying. And God every now and then says, I am the Lord. And he's not the kind of guy who's going to say it just frivolously. He's obviously saying, this is important. Listen in. And the phrase also reminds people about what has been revealed about God's person and his work. So about his person and about the things he does and his relationship to the people. So when he says, I am the Lord, there's a lot in there. He's telling them who he is, what he does, and the relationship he has with the people. Now here's a little look at a little chart of where everyone's camped at this stage. You've got the tent of meeting in the middle, and you've got the Levites living around there, but they're divided into these other sub-tribes that you read about in Numbers. And then you've got the 12 tribes you can see around Judah, Dan, Asher, all those guys going all around. So this is the way that they're camped out, and obviously in the middle is the tent of meeting, which is where God's presence is, which is a key theme to Numbers, like it was in Leviticus. And notice as you read it that the sub-tribes have different roles. They've all got a job to do, the sub-tribes of the Levites. It's not like they're just going around saying, yeah, I'm a Gershonite. You know, it's like they're actually, okay, this is my job. This is what I do each day to serve God. And during holidays, when people are giving even more gifts and offerings to God, for these guys it wouldn't be a holiday. They'd be proper busy. Now, if you remember, a minute ago we looked at Hebrew prose, how it announces a topic, details a topic, and then summarizes a topic. Well, Numbers 4 is a good example of this. Verses 1 to 33 give an extended command. I know before I said you get a topic announced, but in Numbers 4 you've got basically 33 verses where God gives a command, and you could see that as the topic, this command God gives. And then verses 34 to 45, you get an execution report, meaning not that anyone's been killed, but a report of how this has been executed, how it's been carried out. And then finally you get a summary, verses 46 to 49. So just give you an example of this. We won't be able to look at all the verses, but we'll look at just a couple. Numbers 5 to 6, Numbers chapter 4, verse 5 to 6, it says, when it is time for the camp to journey, Aaron and his sons must come and take down the screening curtain and cover the ark of the testimony with it. Then they must put over it a covering of fine leather and spread over that a cloth entirely of blue, and then they must insert its poles. Now this is part of the command God's giving. You look at verse 15, it says, when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is ready to journey, then the Kohathites will come to carry them, but they must not touch any holy thing or they will die. These are the responsibilities of the Kohathites with the tent of meeting. And then in verse 49, you've got, according to the word of the Lord, they were numbered by the authority of Moses, each according to his service and according to what he was to carry. Thus they were numbered by him as the Lord had commanded Moses. So at the beginning, you got the command of what to do. Then you got the explanation of how they actually do this, how everyone's got their own role to play. And then at the end, you get the summary of this. So that's the way Hebrew prose works here in Numbers a lot of the time. Now, in chapter 4, you've got the concept of God's mercy. Verse 20 says, but the Kohathites are not to go into watch while the holy things are being covered, or they will die. Now, there's two ways to view this. A lot of people look at Numbers and say, well, God keeps saying people will die. That don't sound very nice. But really, it's God's mercy, because he's saying, if you go there, you will die. So don't go there. You know, it'd be like if you've got a gas stovetop in your house, you tell your children, don't put your hand in there, it will burn. You're not being nasty, you're letting them know, it will burn. And you guys who aren't consecrated to do this particular job for me, if you go into this place and are involved in these things, you will die. So you've got to make sure you don't. So really we're seeing God's mercy here. He keeps warning them. Now Numbers 5 is fascinating. Verse 11 to 31 talks about marital faithfulness, and it's basically saying, if a husband thinks his wife's cheating on him, this is what you do. And it's quite bizarre what happens. He has to take the woman in to the tent, and then they have to do this ceremony with water and dust to see if she gets cursed by it. And it sounds really bizarre, and you think, what is going on here? But there's actually some really good points about this. One, it avoids cruelty from the husband. Because now there's a system in place. If you think your wife's cheating on you, you bring them here, and this is how we deal with it. So now instead of a husband thinking, I'm going to slap her around or whatever, now he's like, okay, we go to the temple. The other thing is it's, tabernacle. The other thing is it's to do with God's presence in the camp. It's reminding them that, hey, God's presence is in the camp. If there's marital unfaithfulness, that's going to affect God's presence. You've got to bring it into the tabernacle and let God deal with it. It also prevents self-centered charges of unfaithfulness. If you're a bloke and you think your wife's been cheating on you, if you're just being paranoid and you haven't really got a good reason for thinking this, you're probably not going to bother going to the tabernacle, talking to the priest or whoever, and dealing with it in the way that it's laid out in Numbers. You're probably not going to do that. So it's a way of saying, look, are you really sure? Because then you need to do this way. And it's like, okay, well, I don't really think she was actually. I was just being paranoid. And it brings God's presence into the situation. In other words, it brings both parties before the Lord. And there's obviously a clear application here for today, for marriage counseling. You know, people say, oh, the Bible don't tell you anything about counseling. Here, God's saying, bring them together in the presence of the Lord. And I've heard marriage counselors say they've never had a situation where they've told both couples to go off and pray and come back half an hour later where things haven't been better than they were before. Now, in this case, if she's found innocent, the man's jealousy is dealt with. If she's found innocent. Because the guy's gone through this whole system and find the woman's innocent, his jealousy is dealt with. Can't really remember what the point I was going to make about that, but next point, the woman stands before the Lord. The woman actually has to stand there, let her hair down, and she's standing before the Lord. And again, I can't remember the point I was going to make there, sorry. Wrote this a few days ago. But it's a good thing. It's a fascinating story to read as well. Then in Numbers 6, 22 to 27, you'll all know this first. This is the priestly blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. so that they will put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them. Now, Ronald Allen translates it this way. May the Lord Yahweh, as Father, Son, and Spirit, bless his people and keep them. Cause them to know his presence and his grace, and allow them to sense his smile and his peace. Amen. So when he says, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, Ronald is translating this as cause them to know his presence and his grace. So to know God's presence, which is a bit easier to understand than just his face shine upon you, to realize, oh, you actually know God's presence. And when he says turn his face towards you and give him peace, basically Ronald says the way that's translated, turning his face towards you, is smiling, indicating that it's a prayer saying, may God smile at you, which is kind of interesting because that's not a way many people think of God, as God smiling at them. I wonder if anyone's ever pictured God smiling. But after tonight, you can do that. And you can pray that you would sense God smiling at you, and pray for the church that we would all sense God smiling at us. That's quite interesting. Now, the other interesting thing about this is it's directed to the entire community, but all the pronouns, not all the pronouns, the pronouns are singular. It's only in the introductory and the concluding formulas where the plurals are used. And this is characteristic of covenantal language. What I'm reading out here is pretty much word for word from the Expositor's Bible commentary, by the way. It's just so good when it talks about numbers. I can't really put it in my own words better. And reason why it's characteristic of covenantal language is because what God's doing is he's blessing the whole by blessing individuals. And he's blessing individuals by blessing the whole. And that's quite interesting, looking at the way God works. He blesses the whole group by blessing individuals, but at the same time he blesses the individuals by blessing the whole group. And it's like on Sunday when I said Christianity isn't a solo sport, it's a team game. And you see that here with the way God's setting things up for the people. Now you get to chapter 8, 5 to 26. This is where he's setting apart the Levites. Remember, this section here is setting God's people apart. And in verse 14 it says, in this way you are to set the Levites apart from the other Israelites, and the Levites will be mine. And the whole section's interesting because what you see is that holiness is being set apart for the Lord. And too often we think holiness just means being good. But in this case we see he sets these people apart to be dedicated to him. In that sense they're holy, they're set apart. Which means for us today, having our sins dealt with by Jesus' blood, we know that a big part of holiness is being dedicated to doing God's service, serving God, rather than just thinking it's only about us being good and never doing sin. It's about us being dedicated, set apart for God. Now, chapter 9 is the Passover, and remember, it's not chronological because this chapter actually happened before the census in chapter 1, verse 2. So if chapter 9 really happened before chapter 1, we can see that Numbers isn't chronological. And check this out, verse 13, but if a man who is ceremonially clean and not on a journey fails to celebrate the Passover, that person must be cut off from his people because he did not present the Lord's offering at the appointed time. That man will bear the consequences of his sin. So this shows us that the Passover is really important to God. There's two reasons. One is to remind the people they've been rescued by him out of Egypt. The other, I'm sure, is because there's significance later when Jesus died for us. So it's important that we have this concept of Passover. It's important that God's people had that concept so that when Jesus came, it's like, aha, here is a true fulfillment of the Passover. Now, chapter 10, verse 10, it says, also at your times of rejoicing, your appointed feasts and new moon festivals, you are to sound the trumpets over your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, and they will be a memorial for you before your God. I am the Lord your God. So we got this phrase, I am the Lord your God. Shows the importance of the text, but it also shows it's the end of a major unit of the book, because he's saying, I am the Lord your God. And so let's see what unit that was. It was the first unit here, setting apart the people. So when you get to chapter 10, verse 10, just remember it by 10:10. CB talk, 10:10 Tiger. So the people have been set apart. Now what happens next is a setting forth of the people, because they're to go into the promised land. Chapter 10, verse 11 to verse 36. And basically the people have been prepared to march into the promised land as God's people. So Numbers could have been a very short book if everything had gone according to plan. Verse 33, so they set out from the mountain of the Lord and travelled for 3 days. The ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them during those 3 days to find them a place to rest. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out from the camp. And it looks really good. It's like, yeah, they're going out. But then you go to if we look at our, outline here, we've just done part A, okay, which is the preparation for marching into the land. Now we're at part B, which is the rebellion and judgment of a fearful people. It gets very depressing at this point, very depressing. Let's look at the first part here. First part is a cycle of rebellion and atonement and the record of death. 11 verse 1 to chapter 20 verse 29. You've got like 9 chapters of this. Check it out. The people have been prepared to march into the promised land as God's people, but instead they start moaning. And then God's wrath comes, but God is still merciful. It's something you can learn about God as you read Numbers, is the mercy of God. No matter how bad these people are, His mercy. Then we get to Numbers 12 verse 3, the bit about Moses' meekness. And what happens? Chapter 12 verse 1, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Verse 3. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. So some people say, well, this was added by someone else later. An editor may have put this in later, maybe one of Moses' contemporaries, just like at the end where it talks about Moses going off in the Pentateuch, when it says about Moses going off to die, that was probably written by someone like Joshua or something. Now, there's not really anything wrong with believing this wasn't written by Moses. Some people think it means you're not an evangelical Christian if you think that. But when you look at the Gospel of the book of Acts and how Luke wrote it and said he got different sources, we know that inspiration doesn't mean there's one man there just going zzz, like this. He's being controlled and he can't do anything. So in many ways, there's nothing wrong with actually thinking that Moses might have wrote Numbers and then someone, one of Moses' contemporaries, who would have been viewed with that same kind of authority as like the apostles were in the New Testament, that person might have added in a few bits and it's still inspired scripture. And if that was the case, who would be the most likely candidate? Joshua. I think if Joshua had written this in, I don't think there's any problem with people thinking, there's no problem with saying it's not inspired scripture. I mean, Joshua was a pretty righteous guy. But we don't know that for sure. I'm just saying that's one idea, and there's no need to try and kick them out of the Christian camp if they believe that. Because there's an argument as well to say Moses did write it. Check it out. I'm reading from the New International Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. It certainly must be conceded that in other ancient autobiographies, where the author where the author speaks of himself in the third person, self-evaluations occur that seem to be rather surprising, for they stand in contrast to the author's usual references to his own character. Before we go on, what that is explaining is, in ancient literature, if it switches into the third person, it's often describing a change in character. You expect someone to be one way, suddenly they're another way. And so they refer to themselves in the third person. And now we get an example about Julius Caesar. Thus, in Julius Caesar's civil war, in the Alexandrian War, he speaks of his own discomfiture at the unexpected attack of the troops of Pharnaces in Pontus, saying, Caesar was startled by this incredible rashness, or self-confidence. He was caught off guard and unprepared. He was simultaneously calling the troops away from the fortification work which they had been engaged in, ordering them to arm, deploying the legions and forming the battle line. In other words, Caesar had misjudged the enemy and therefore had been caught flat-footed, as it were. Ordinarily, Caesar presents himself as a paragon of foresightedness and a master strategist. So this derogatory comment about himself comes as a real surprise. So what they're showing here is there's an example where Caesar is talking about himself, and he talks about himself in the third person because he's letting you know that the way he was at this juncture was not what you would expect him to be. So, one argument is that Moses, when he says here he's the most humble person, is that when you're reading it, the scorn that Moses is getting, and these people now are slagging off his wife, and then you'd expect Moses to be a certain way and be like, that's it, I'm going to get God to punish you. And instead it's saying Moses was the most humble man. So he's put himself in the third person because he's letting you know, hey, it's not what you expect. That's a possibility. I read a bit more from the New International Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties. Any other leader in his position would surely have faced them with a withering reply, but Moses turned the matter completely over to God. We need the information contained in verse 3 in order to make sense of this amazing meekness in this situation. Therefore, it seems rather unlikely that verse 3 could have been a later interpolation, in other words, put into the text later, when it actually furnishes a key to the understanding of the whole episode that introduces it. So what these guys are saying is it probably wasn't added later because this is an essential part of the original story. Because Moses had to put this in there to let them know this is why he didn't react in a certain way, because of his meekness. So that's one argument. So I've just given you two arguments how it could work out. I'm going to give you a third. Cleon Rogers, and this is Ronald Allen quotes him. If anyone wants to read the paper Cleon wrote on this, then let me know. Cleon Rogers presents evidence from etymology and usage that miserable is a possible reading, and from context that is the preferable meaning in this text. And this view has been taken quite seriously by a lot of scholars. There's a possibility that what we translate as meekness actually means Moses was the most miserable person on the earth. Now, that's believable. I don't know if that's correct, but it's certainly believable because when you read the Pentateuch, I would be miserable, and you've got Moses asking God for him to die and saying how he's had enough of his job and he wants to die. So it's possible that it's actually saying, look, his own family are slagging him off now, slagging off his wife, and he is just so miserable. He's so fed up with everything. So like I said, if anyone wants to read that paper by Rogers, let me know. Now, Numbers 15, you basically, after a narrative of moaning and spying, you got all this moaning going on, and then you got the guys going out to spy. So it's quite interesting. You got them moaning, then you got them going and spying out the promised land to see what it's like. And they come back and they're like, it's great, but we can't go in there because it's too scary, because these guys are huge and we're not going to win the battle. Now, after this, you get an abrupt change, because you're reading it, you get to chapter 15 and you're thinking, boy, God's wrath is just going to come down on these people, because you're like, they are being so ungrateful. They're always moaning, always saying it would be better for us to be back in Egypt. They do terrible things. So you think, that's it. They're going to be completely destroyed. And, in verses 1 to 2, you get an abrupt change. You get a mention of God's promised. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to the Israelites and tell them, when you enter the land where you are to live, which I am giving you. It's amazing. Amidst all this, God then says, hey, I want to prepare the people for when they go into the promised land. It's a great sign of God's faithfulness. And it's important we see these things instead of people just always focusing on, that guy got killed by God, God's evil. It's like, well, look at the grace of God. After all, it would be like If your children are really naughty to you, really, really rude, and you have to punish them, you have to discipline them, but then you say to them, hey, when we do go to Legoland, and it's like, you're not going to let them go to Legoland right there and then, but you're like, hey, it is going to happen. I'm going to take you to Legoland. We're going to prepare you for that. People will be like, wow, that's a pretty cool parent who could act like that. And that's the way God is. Now notice, I underlined the Lord spoke. You'll see 3 divisions where it says the Lord spoke. So look out for that. It's important if it says that. Now, jump to verse 30. Another verse we need to cover because people will think about this. But the person who acts defiantly, whether native born or a resident foreigner, insults the Lord. That person must be cut off from among his people. Someone who acts defiantly towards God, they must be cut off from the people. Been a lot of talk about this verse. What does it mean? Now check it out. From the Net Bible, the notes say, the sin is described literally as acting with a high hand. The expression means that someone would do something with deliberate defiance, with an arrogance in spite of what the Lord said. It's as if the sinner was about to attack God, or at least lifting his hand against God. So when people say, oh, it's a bit harsh, isn't it? Well, the language, this is like someone going to God like, I've had it. I'm going to do my thing. I'm not listening to you. And so that's why God says they got to be cut off. This is like a cancer. We got to cut this out from the people. Now, similar expressions are in Exodus 14:8 and Numbers 33 verse 3. Now, that's the first generation in the desert. And to finish off the first generation in the desert, at chapter 21, verses 1, going all the way through to chapter 25:18, you've got the final part, which is the climax of rebellion, but also hope and the end of their dying. God has told these people that because of them not going into the promised land, like remember, they refused to go into the promised land. God said, here's the promised land. They have a look, they're like, oh, the guys in there are a bit big. I don't think we can take them on. They refuse to go. So God says, because of that, you're going to wander the desert for around 40 years. When you guys have all died and your children have grown up, they're going to go in the promised land instead. Now, to me, that is completely fair. I think that's completely fair. He said, here it is. And they said, no, we don't want it. Just like when people say it's unfair that people go to hell. Well, God says, here's heaven. And people say, no, we don't want it. Like someone said once, the door to hell shuts or locks on the inside. No one's pushing them in there. People are choosing to go. And so this is what happens. And you've got to wait for all these guys to die before people can go in the promised land. Now, Numbers 21, verses 1 to 3. In verse 2 it says, so Israel made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed deliver this people into our hand, then we will utterly destroy their cities. You start getting these battles go on. It gets quite exciting at this point. And this is a turning point for Israel. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? Like, they tell God we're utterly destroy them. You're like, so what? But the language there is to do with what you might have heard as the ban or the devotion. Utterly destroy means whatever was put to this ban or devotion belonged to God, either for his use or for his destruction. So what they're saying is, we destroy them and we do it for you, Lord. If there's anything left over, you can have it as an offering or you can destroy it. We're not going to take any of the spoils for ourselves. We're not going to take the money for ourselves, the women for ourselves. It's dedicated to you. So it's an oath saying they're not taking anything for themselves. It's simply removing what is alien to God's faith, to the people of God. So it's saying these guys don't worship you, we'll remove them. And this was a turning point for Israel. But you still got to have the older generation has to die, the younger generation come through. Now, under structure, anyone remember what I called this book? Bifid, that's right. It's got 2 parts. First part is the first generation. Second part is the second generation who are going to enter the promised land. This is what we're going to look at now. We're basically at the end. Chapter 26, going through to chapter 36, verse 13, is the second generation to enter the promised land. That's strange. And the way this works is you've got part A, the preparation for the triumphal march to the promised land. in chapter 26. Remember, that's already happened for the first generation, has to happen for the second generation. Part B, a review of the first generation's journey and words of warning and encouragement to the second generation. Part C, an anticipation of the promised land. And D, the prospects for the second generation are for good, but the warning from the experience of the first generation must not be forgotten. Now, let's have a look at just one verse in this section. Numbers 35, verse 34. Do not defile the land where you live and where I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. And he talks about blood on the land, which is something we see in other parts of Scripture. And what you've got to remember as you read Numbers is that the focus is on God's presence being with the people. So God's saying, when you go into this promised land, don't defile it. I don't want blood being spilt on the land, like with Abel's blood when Cain killed him. I don't want that on the land because I'm going to be there with you, so the land mustn't be defiled. Now, to sum up, let's look at the applications for Numbers, because you want to be able to make applications in it. The book is fascinating. I can't do it justice because there's so much going on in Numbers. The structure is so complicated. But when you read, I've left out loads and loads of exciting stuff here, but when you read it, it is a fascinating book. Now, Olson, who's the guy who came up with that bifid structure, he says that Numbers functions as a paradigm for every succeeding generation of God's people. It invites every generation to put itself in the place of the new generation. In other words, he views an application as that the first generation messed up in the wilderness, but then the next generation went into the promised land. We should all act like that next generation. Not be like the first generation, but be like the generation that went into the promised land. Not moaning and grumbling and not refusing to take God's promises. You know, maybe often we act like the guys in the wilderness. And there's this whole land of milk and honey and we don't want to take it. And God's like, well, it's there for you. Take it. And there's warnings against disobedience, like in Hebrews 3, verse 8, it says, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of testing in the wilderness. There your fathers tested me and tried me, and they saw my works for 40 years. So this is quite safe application to make, because even in the New Testament, this application is made. Don't be like the first generation. And as you read through the first generation, you'll identify with it a lot of the time. And you'll be like, oh, this is me. So then we got to say, all right, let's not be like them. We'll be like the second generation. Now, we also learn a lot about the character of God. We really do learn loads in Numbers. And you see that despite his people rebelling, he still provides for them in the wilderness. You know, here's a God who gives food to people that moan about the food. You know, they moan about bread, so he gives them meat. You know, he still keeps providing for them all the time. Even though he has to punish them at times, he provides for them. And in the New Testament, God provided the cross for us. It's the same God in the Old and New Testament. What's interesting, there's one bit in Numbers with the bronze snake. What's happening is the people are getting bitten by these snakes and they're getting sick. So what God says to Moses is, make a bronze snake, put it up on a pole and tell the people to look at it, and they get healed. Now that's really bizarre, because the snake is the thing that's biting them and causing them sickness. And the snake, obviously, you think of snake, you're going to think of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. You're going to be like, that's kind of weird. And you're like, why did God do that? Well, you see in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, just as the snake was put up on the stick, I, the Son of Man, will be lifted high. That's kind of like a paraphrase. So Jesus is showing we've got a type, what's called typology here. Something that happened earlier is a type of what's going to happen with Jesus. Now, we don't know how far the type goes, because with a type, you don't necessarily apply every single thing. But one thing we do know is the snake was put up in the air on a pole, and people were healed through that. Jesus was put up on a cross, and we're healed through that. But the other thing, and it might be going too far, but it seems kind of so obvious. The snake is the thing that is hurting the people. When Jesus went on the cross, he's got the appearance, he's got the form of the sinful nature on him. It says that in Romans. So Jesus took sin on the cross so that we could be freed from sin. So it does seem there's a real similarity going on there. And it just shows how much Jesus went through for us. It's like Jesus came down here, took on the appearance of sinful nature, so that, I know it sounds a bit weird me saying that, can't think of the exact verse in Romans. It's why there's the word there, the appearance or the form. It's not really saying Jesus was, but it's kind of like the form of it. He's there up on the cross. Surely we thought he's accursed by God, and actually what he's doing is taking our sins and getting them dealt with on the cross. So it's quite deep what Jesus has done for us. So we see the same God in the Old Testament that we see in the New Testament. And finally, there's the breakdown of the book again, so you can have a look at it. If you get this structure, it will really help you. If you get that there's the first generation, there's a second generation, it will help you. If you get, especially the beginning bit, that with the first generation they're being set apart, and then they're being set forth to go into the land, that's important. And it shows us a bit as well about us being God's people and being holy, being set apart from. So that's Numbers. You will have fun reading it, I'm sure. There's so much in there. So, any questions?